Ma'am, you need to step away from this property right now and leave the premises.
I'm sorry.
Leave?
I live here.
I received a call from the homeowner reporting someone trespassing in the yard.
Then whoever called you is mistaken. I am
What
the
exactly were
homeowner.
you
This
told?
is my
You don't
house.
look like the description I was given. The caller said the homeowner is an elderly white woman and you should sue for
Officer,
attention.
the caller is wrong. My name is Dr. Sarah Clarkson, and I've lived in this home for 12 years.
Right.
Yes,
I'm
doctor.
going to need you to stop arguing and step away from the property.
I'm not arguing. I'm telling you that you're standing on my property and accusing me of trespassing.
Then you shouldn't have any problem proving it.
I won't have a problem.
But you should understand something first.
Officer Jacob Anderson had been with the Riverside Police Department for 3 years, and in those 3 years, he had compiled a record that should have produced a conversation, the kind of sustained, documented, supervisory conversation that personnel systems are designed to generate when a pattern becomes visible in the complaint files of a single officer. 5 complaints, all 5 involving black residents in the department's more affluent residential corridors. A man trimming hedges outside house on Elmwood Drive, stopped and asked if he worked there. A teenage girl walking home from school on Briarwood Lane, detained and questioned about where she was going. A retired couple sitting on their own porch on Clearwater Avenue, approached and asked to verify their address. Each complaint had been processed through the same resolution pathway. Each had produced the same outcome. Each had been filed in the same folder that nobody had been asked to read as a sequence. Anderson had continued his patrol rotation after each one, his instincts intact, his pattern uninterrupted, the institutional signal he was receiving from the absence of consequence as clear and consistent as anything his training had ever communicated. On a Tuesday evening in April, that pattern finally encountered someone who had spent 22 years building her life in the exact neighborhood Anderson had spent 3 years treating as a space requiring his supervision. And that encounter would end his career, cost the city $3 million, and expose a department that had received 5 identical complaints in 3 years and had never once placed them side by side and asked what they added up to. Sarah Clarkson was standing in the front yard of her home on Birchwood Court at 8:01 p.m. when Anderson's cruiser slowed at the curb. She was in her blue hospital scrubs, the same scrubs she had been wearing since 6 a.m. that morning, the blue that her hospital issued and that she wore through 12-hour shifts in the cardiac care unit where she had worked as an attending physician for 9 years. Her hospital ID badge was clipped to the left breast pocket of the scrub top, visible from the sidewalk, carrying her photograph, her name, and her department designation in the institutional format of a credential that her hospital required her to wear at all times during working hours, and that she hadn't yet had the opportunity to remove because she had driven home from the hospital, pulled into her own driveway, and walked onto her own front lawn approximately 4 minutes before Anderson's cruiser appeared at the end of her street. Her natural hair framed her face in the particular fullness of someone who had not had time to think about her appearance since before the morning's first case. Her expression, captured in Anderson's body camera as he stepped out of his cruiser, was the expression of a woman who had just finished a 12-hour shift in a cardiac care unit, was standing on her own lawn 4 minutes from her front door, and was looking at a police officer walking toward her with the specific, evaluative attention of someone trying to determine what category of encounter this was going to turn out to be. She was 41 years old. She had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. She had been a homeowner on Birchwood Court for 6 years. She had a mortgage statement, a deed, 6 years of property tax payments, and a neighbor on either side who knew her by name and had her number in their phones. None of that was visible to Anderson when he stepped out of his cruiser. What was visible was a black woman in blue scrubs standing on a lawn in a neighborhood that Anderson's 3-year patrol pattern had established, in his operational vocabulary, as a space requiring his particular brand of attention whenever the person occupying it didn't match the picture his assumptions had built of who belonged there. He walked toward her with the purposeful, unhurried stride of someone who had done this before and had never faced a consequence that required him to reconsider doing it again. Before we go any further, drop your city or country in the comments right now, and if you're new here, subscribe before this video ends. This story gets more consequential with every chapter, and you will not want to miss where it goes. Officer Jacob Anderson had been with the Riverside Police Department for 3 years and 2 months. His performance evaluations described him in the language that evaluations use when the person writing them is trying to be accurate about strengths without being specific about concerns. Confident in residential patrol situations, demonstrates initiative in community engagement, proactive in identifying potential disturbances. The 5 complaints in his file used a different vocabulary. They used words like assumption, profile, belonging, and without basis, words that appeared in each of the 5 complaint narratives with the specific consistency of a pattern that was waiting for someone to read all 5 documents in sequence rather than one at a time. Nobody had read them in sequence, not once in 3 years and 2 months. His body camera activated at 20:01:02 as he stepped out of his cruiser on Birchwood Court. The timestamp was precise, the audio was clear, and the woman in the blue scrubs standing on a lawn 4 minutes from her own front door had a hospital ID badge clipped to her chest, a mortgage on the property beneath her feet, and 22 years of medical training that had absolutely nothing to do with why Anderson was walking toward her and everything to do with what the next 14 minutes were going to cost the city of Riverside. Officer Jacob Anderson had been with the Riverside Police Department for 3 years and 2 months. His performance evaluations described him in the language that evaluations use when the person writing them is trying to be accurate about strengths without being specific about concerns. Confident in residential patrol situations, demonstrates initiative in community engagement, proactive in identifying potential disturbances. The 5 complaints in his file used a different vocabulary. They used words like assumption, profile, belonging, and without basis, words that appeared in each of the 5 complaint narratives with the specific consistency of a pattern that was waiting for someone to read all 5 documents in sequence rather than one at a time. Nobody had read them in sequence, not once in 3 years and 2 months. His body camera activated at 20:01:02 as he stepped out of his cruiser on Birchwood Court. The timestamp was precise, the audio was clear, and the woman in the blue scrubs standing on a lawn 4 minutes from her own front door had a hospital ID badge clipped to her chest, a mortgage on the property beneath her feet, and 22 years of medical training that had absolutely nothing to do with why Anderson was walking toward her and everything to do with what the next 14 minutes were going to cost the city of Riverside. Sarah Clarkson had not taken a full weekend off in 4 years. Not because the hospital required it. Her contract specified standard attending physician hours, the same contract that every physician in the cardiac care unit signed, and then most of them managed to honor without surrendering every Saturday to a pager that went off at 6 a.m. Sarah honored it differently. She was in the unit because cardiac events did not schedule themselves around contractual hour limits, and she had understood since her first year of residency that the kind of physician she intended to be required a different relationship with availability than the contract described. She had grown up in a household where that relationship was not unusual. Her parents had emigrated from Nigeria when Sarah was 4. Her father an engineer who had requalified his credentials through night school while working days. Her mother a seamstress who had built a small alterations business from a sewing machine in the spare bedroom and expanded it through the specific patient compounding of quality work and word-of-mouth reputation. They had taught Sarah, not through instruction, but through the daily observable evidence of their lives, that the distance between where you started and where you intended to go was measured entirely in the quality and consistency of the work you were willing to do in between. She had taken that lesson to Vanderbilt for her undergraduate degree, to Johns Hopkins for medical school, and into a cardiac care residency that her program director had described in her final evaluation as the most committed he had supervised in 14 years. The house on Birchwood Court was the physical result of 22 years of that commitment. Purchased 6 years ago, mortgage current, yard maintained with the same attention she brought to everything she considered worth doing properly. She had earned every square foot of it. That was the part Jacob Anderson's 3-year patrol pattern had never been designed to consider. The dog walker's name was Raymond Osai. He had lived on Elmwood Drive for 11 years, longer than Anderson had been alive as a licensed driver. Longer than the subdivision's current HOA president had owned their property, longer than almost anyone on the street except the retired couple at the end of the cul-de-sac who had been there since the development was built. He walked his Labrador every Tuesday and Thursday evening at 7:30, the same route, the same pace, the same wave to the same neighbors who had been waving back for 11 years. Anderson had stopped him on a Thursday in January, asked where he lived, and when Raymond pointed to the house 40 feet behind them, the brick colonial with the green shutters that Raymond had painted himself 2 summers ago, Anderson had asked him to verify it. Raymond had produced his driver's license, which carried the Elmwood Drive address, and Anderson had logged the stop as a wellness check and moved on. Raymond had filed the complaint the following morning. It had been resolved through conflict resolution training that Anderson attended on a Wednesday afternoon and that produced no documented change in his patrol behavior in any subsequent evaluation. The real estate agent's name was Denise Caro. She had been showing a property on Briarwood Lane on a Saturday morning, a legitimate scheduled showing with a lockbox code provided by the listing agent and a client waiting in the driveway. Anderson had approached her between the car and the door, asked what she was doing, and when she explained and produced her real estate license, had told her the neighborhood had been experiencing break-ins and that he was being thorough. Denise's complaint used the word humiliated twice. It had been filed in the same folder as Raymond's. Neither had been placed beside the other. Neither had been read as the beginning of something. They were the second and third complaints. Sarah Clarkson's Tuesday evening on Birchwood Court would be the last. The call came into dispatch at 7:59 p.m. The caller did not provide a name. They described themselves as a concerned neighbor and described the situation as a suspicious individual on the lawn of the property at 14 Birchwood Court, a black woman in scrubs who had been standing in the yard for several minutes and who the caller did not recognize. The caller's voice on the dispatch recording carried the specific quality of someone who had made this kind of call before and developed a vocabulary for it. Suspicious, unfamiliar, doesn't seem to belong. Language precise enough to generate a response and vague enough to resist being characterized as anything other than civic concern. The property at 14 Birchwood Court had been owned by Sarah Clarkson for 6 years. Her name was on the deed, the mortgage, and the property tax record. Her car, the gray SUV visible in the driveway on Anderson's body camera, was registered to her address. She had lived there through 2 HOA presidents, 3 neighborhood block parties, and the complete renovation of the kitchen that the contractor completed 18 months ago. She had introduced herself to every neighbor within 4 houses in both directions when she moved in. Most of them had her number. The one who called dispatch apparently did not. Anderson received the call at 7:59 p.m. and responded with the particular enthusiasm that his patrol log consistently showed for calls originating from the Birchwood corridor, the residential stretch that his 5 prior complaints had all involved, the corridor that his instincts had established as requiring his specific brand of attention. He logged it as a suspicious person call and pulled on to Birchwood Court at 8:01 p.m. Sarah had been home for 7 minutes. She was standing on her own lawn in her hospital scrubs, her ID badge clipped to her chest, her keys in her hand, doing nothing that any honest description of the observable situation would characterize as suspicious. And the neighbor who had called had lived 4 houses down for 3 years without once learning whose lawn they were reporting. Anderson reached the lawn at 8:02 p.m. and asked Sarah what she was doing there. Not who she was, not whether everything was all right, what she was doing. The specific phrasing of someone who has already decided that presence requires justification rather than greeting, that the first question owed to a person standing on a lawn is not courtesy but accounting. Sarah looked at him with the expression the body camera had been capturing since he stepped out of the cruiser. The evaluative, controlled attention of someone running a rapid professional assessment of a situation that her 12-hour shift had left her with limited patience for, but unlimited composure to manage. She told him she lived there. She gestured toward the front door behind her with the car keys still in her hand, the keys that fit the gray SUV in the driveway and the lock on the door of the house she had owned for 6 years. Anderson asked if she could prove it. Sarah reached into the stack of mail she had collected from the box 4 minutes before he arrived. She produced 3 envelopes, a utility statement, a mortgage correspondence, and a medical journal subscription renewal, each one addressed to Dr. Sarah Clarkson at 14 Birchwood Court. She held them where the body camera could read the addresses clearly and where Anderson could read them without moving closer than he already was. He looked at them the way Peterson had looked at Caldwell's credential and the way Barnes had looked at Perry's badge, registering without revising, processing the information through a framework that had already reached its conclusion and was now simply looking for a reason not to accept the evidence that contradicted it. He asked if anyone could confirm she lived there. Sarah looked at him for a moment in the specific silence of someone who has just been asked, while holding addressed mail at her own address, to produce a witness to her own existence. Then she said that the mortgage company confirmed it every month and had been doing so for 6 years without requiring a co-signer from the Riverside Police Department. The body camera recorded the sentence in full. Anderson did not respond to it. He told her to stay where she was. Sergeant Diane Williams arrived on Birchwood Court at 8:09 p.m. She had been 3 blocks away when Anderson's call came through, a request for backup on a suspicious person situation that she had flagged for personal response the moment she heard the address. Not because Birchwood Court was a high-incident street. It wasn't. Because it was the 3rd call Anderson had generated from this specific residential corridor in 4 months, and Williams had been meaning to pull his full complaint file for 6 weeks and had not yet done it, and the specific combination of Anderson's name and this address on a Tuesday evening had produced in her the supervisory instinct that arrives when a pattern you have been meaning to examine presents itself in real time and removes the option of examining it later. She stepped out of her cruiser and read the scene in the practiced, comprehensive way of a supervisor who has been reading scenes for 12 years. Anderson on the lawn, a black woman in blue hospital scrubs, ID badge visible, mail in one hand, car keys in the other, standing in front of a house with a gray SUV in the driveway that matched the registration Williams ran on her dashboard before she reached the front walk. The registration came back in 11 seconds. Registered owner, Dr. Sarah Clarkson. Address, 14 Birchwood Court. Williams looked at the screen, then at Anderson, then at Sarah. Then she did the thing that the situation required and that Anderson had not done in the 8 minutes preceding her arrival. She introduced herself, apologized for the interruption, and asked Sarah directly if she was all right. Sarah said she was fine. She said it with the controlled exhaustion of someone who had managed a cardiac emergency at 6 a.m. and was now managing a different kind of emergency on her own lawn at 8:09 p.m. and was running low on the specific energy required to treat both with equal professional composure. Williams turned to Anderson. She used his badge number. She told him to return to his cruiser and that she would be submitting a formal supervisory review request before end of shift. Anderson opened his mouth. Williams held up one hand, the single, flat, unhurried gesture that 12 years of supervision had refined into its most efficient form, and he closed it. His suspension was processed before midnight. The complaint file, all 5 prior entries, was pulled from the folder and laid end to end on Williams' desk at 10:43 p.m. She read them in sequence for the first time. It took her 22 minutes. She submitted the internal affairs referral at 11:07 p.m. It had taken one supervisor 22 minutes to see what 3 years of individual reviews had never been asked to find. Sarah's attorney filed the civil rights lawsuit 19 days after the incident. The complaint was 41 pages. It moved through the standard civil rights claims, unlawful detention, racial discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause, Fourth Amendment violations, and arrived in its most consequential section at a legal theory that the department's attorneys would spend 4 months attempting to refute and ultimately abandon entirely before the trial's second week: willful blindness. The theory was precise, and the evidence supporting it was cleaner than most civil rights complaints ever produced. 5 complaints, 3 years, 5 separate supervisory reviews, 5 individual closure decisions made without any reviewer being required to consult the complaints that preceded the one they were currently reading. The department's own complaint processing protocol required pattern review after 3 complaints against any officer within a 24-month period. Anderson had generated 5 in 38 months. The protocol had not been triggered once. Sarah's attorney did not argue that the department had reviewed the pattern and ignored it. She argued something more damaging, that the department had constructed a review process so deliberately compartmentalized that the pattern could not be seen by design. That the folder existed, the complaints existed, the protocol existed, and that the gap between them was not an oversight, but an architecture. A system built to process individual complaints efficiently while remaining structurally blind to what they accumulated into. The city's legal team had no answer for the protocol document. It was their own policy, signed by the current police commissioner, requiring exactly the pattern review that had not happened. The gap between the written requirement and the documented practice was not a legal argument, it was an exhibit. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. $3 million, unanimous. The verdict's written finding used the phrase willful blindness 4 times in 3 paragraphs, once for each year Anderson had been on the force, and once for the system that had watched him operate without reading the file that Williams had read in 22 minutes on a Tuesday night with nothing but a desk and an unread folder. Anderson's law enforcement certification was revoked 41 days after the verdict. Not suspended, not placed under review pending appeal, revoked, the permanent transferable consequence that decertification carries, the one that follows an officer across state lines and department applications, and the years that separate one attempt at re-entry from the next. He could not work in law enforcement in the state of Riverside. He could not apply to a neighboring jurisdiction and present a clean record. The decertification was entered into the national database that hiring departments were required to check before extending any conditional offer, which meant that the 3 years and 2 months he had spent building a patrol pattern on the residential corridors of Birchwood Court had produced as their permanent professional legacy a record that closed every subsequent door in the field he had chosen. He was 27 years old. His career in law enforcement was finished before it had produced a single outcome worth defending. Sarah Clarkson testified before the Riverside City Council 6 weeks after the decertification was entered. She came in her hospital scrubs, the same blue, the same ID badge clipped to the left breast pocket because she had a shift that morning and a shift that evening, and the city council meeting fell in the 4-hour window between them that she had decided to use for this rather than sleep, because some things were worth the 4 hours. She stood at the podium and covered exactly the ground she had been thinking about since 8:02 p.m. on a Tuesday evening when a police officer asked her to justify her presence on her own lawn. She said the issue was not Jacob Anderson. Anderson was a symptom. The issue was the folder, the system that received 5 complaints, generated 5 individual resolutions, and never once asked what 5 looked like when you put them in a room together and read them as a single document rather than 5 separate inconveniences. She said she was a physician. She said that in medicine, a pattern of symptoms that appeared 5 times in 3 years in the same patient would never be treated as 5 unrelated events. It would be treated as a diagnosis requiring a systemic response. She said the city needed to decide whether it was going to apply the same standard to its own records that it required of the professionals working within its hospitals. She said she was going back to the cardiac care unit after this. She said her patients did not have the luxury of waiting for the city to read its own files. She said she hoped the council did not require a 6th complaint to arrive at the same conclusion that Sergeant Williams had reached in 22 minutes on a Tuesday night with nothing but a desk and an unread folder. Then she thanked them for their time and left for the hospital. The council voted unanimously to implement mandatory cumulative complaint review after 2 complaints against any officer within a 36-month period. The protocol was named after no one. It was simply the rule that should have existed before Raymond Osai walked his dog on a Thursday evening and the folder started filling up with evidence that nobody had been asked to read. If this story held you from the first dispatch call to the last words Sarah said at that podium, if it made you think about the folder, about what 5 complaints look like when someone finally reads them together, about what changes when a sergeant sits down for 22 minutes and does what 3 years of individual reviews never did, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Sarah Clarkson's exist because a sergeant pulled a file on a Tuesday night and a physician chose a city council meeting over 4 hours of sleep. We tell them because the people whose complaints are in folders that nobody has read yet deserve to know that the folder exists and that someone is eventually going to open it. If you want more stories about accountability, systemic failure, and the people who force the system to read its own records, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a video. We post stories exposing racial profiling, police misconduct, and the moments when the pattern finally became impossible to ignore. Every story is documented, every one matters, and the folder is never as empty as the system thinks it is.